Thank you, everybody. Oh, it's so good to be here, and thanks for coming. Unfortunately, my partner, Chris Smalls, had a travel issue. He might be able to get in before the end of this. I hope he does. But I'm going to talk a little bit about my piece of the story. One of the reasons I'm here, and Chris, by the way, we'll get here at some point today, and we're doing another event, by the way, on the 13th at a club called the Far Out Club. If you want to see us together. Is we really sort of figured out that his battle against Amazon as a labor organizer, and my battle against Chevron as an environmental lawyer had a lot of similarities. And these similarities really touch on big ideas that really impact at a very deep level our country at this moment in time. The lawsuit I worked on, it's now been literally over 30 years, against Chevron is more than a lawsuit, in my opinion. It is a vehicle that absolutely terrifies the fossil fuel industry, which is one reason that my personal journey ended up putting me in detention for almost 3 years as a human rights lawyer in the United States of America. And Chris's struggle and the struggle of Chris and his colleagues, and we have one of his colleagues here, Derek Palmer, over here, Vice President of the Amazon Labor Union. Hey, Derek. Their struggle is more than just about organizing the first successful labor union ever against Amazon for warehouse workers. It really is a struggle about, I think, the future of the labor movement in this country. So that's sort of how we approach thinking about this, and we'll be talking more about that on the 13th, on the event we're doing that evening. But as far as my story, I just want to briefly summarize it. It's a long story. I've spoken a fair amount about this, so hopefully I can distill it into a size that we can fairly quickly digest. And then I want to open it up really to the floor, since we kind of have a relatively intimate crowd. And I think there's an app that everyone has. If during this time you want to ask a question, throw it in the app, and we'll open it up the last 15 or 20 minutes and talk a little bit about it. And we also have an extra special guest here, a surprise guest who I'm going to bring up on stage toward the end of my talk. And I think you'll find that really interesting. So, to sort of cut to the chase, I have worked in human rights law for many, many years, and I ended up in prison in this country. And I want to talk a little bit about how that happened and why I think it happened. The beginning of the story traces back to the early 1990s when I was a law student at Harvard. I was actually in the same class as President Obama. And a classmate of ours was from Ecuador, and he and his father organized a mission to the Ecuadorian Amazon to investigate what we heard was a terrible oil contamination. And we went down there in April of 1993 when I was much, much younger, and spent a week down there. And really, what we found shocked my conscience and really changed my life. Basically, what had happened is Texaco, American Oil Company, now owned by Chevron, had deliberately and systematically discharged billions of gallons of cancer-causing toxic waste onto indigenous ancestral lands in the Amazon where 5 indigenous groups lived. And you can go down there today, which is now 50 years, it's over 50 years after this started, and you can see open air waste pits gouged out of the floor of the jungle. Many of them have pipes in the side of the waste pit to run the oil waste into rivers and streams that the locals were using for their drinking water, for their bathing, and their fishing. Essentially, Texaco made a decision, or the engineers made a decision when they designed the system of production to pollute. So this was not like the Exxon Valdez, it was not like the Deepwater Horizon spill. It was pollution by design to inflate already robust profits to obscene levels. That's what the decision was by the Texaco people. And when we got there, the people that we met some of the indigenous peoples and non-indigenous farmer communities from other parts of Ecuador who had settled in the Amazon. It wasn't just indigenous peoples affected, but non-indigenous peoples as well. They were really, really hurting. There were cancers, all sorts of health problems, virtually no medical care, virtually no doctors in the region, and really no one had enough money to be able to leave the area. So people were forced to drink contaminated water, breathe contaminated air, and really eat contaminated food as part of their daily life. And the crazy part is this used to be, prior to Texaco's arrival in the 1960s, a very, very wealthy area. Not wealthy as most of us up here understand wealth, and we usually measure wealth by money, okay? In the forest, you measure wealth by your quality of life, by the food you have, the fresh water you have, your culture, and all sorts of other kind of metrics that don't really compute necessarily in the North. So people felt like they had very prosperous lives, and when we went down there and saw this utter disaster, it felt apocalyptic just looking at it. We decided as lawyers to try to do something about it, and we initiated a lawsuit in 1993, November 3rd, 1993, in US federal court in New York against Texaco. And we decided to try to go big from the beginning. We sued them for billions of dollars. That was the estimated cost of a cleanup of a disaster of this massive scale. I remember this was pre-internet and sitting in my apartment, like faxing out a press release to various news outlets, and we made it onto CBS Nightly News with Dan Rather. It was like a huge thing, like at the very beginning of a lawsuit, like it almost never happens. And we were off and running. And Texaco spent the next several years trying to block us from getting to a trial in the United States. Ultimately, they were able to convince the US court after 10 years of litigation, during which time many people were hurting and dying in Ecuador, to shift it down to Ecuador's courts on the theory that the damage was in Ecuador, and Ecuador would be a better forum to have the trial in than the United States. So they kind of won that battle, but there was a silver lining for us, which is that the judge, as a condition of moving it down to Ecuador, forced them to accept the jurisdiction of Ecuador's courts. Of course, they thought they could just go down there and we would disappear. As American lawyers, we wouldn't go to Ecuador to continue the case. But we built a team of great Ecuadorian and international lawyers, raised funds to do the case, and we started this trial in 2003, which was a huge victory for us, because the first thing these corporations do when you sue them is they try to figure out a way not to have a trial, because they don't want the evidence to come in, they don't want the media to cover it, they don't want to look bad. Okay, so we won that first battle, we got jurisdiction over them. We started a trial, and I swear to you, at the time I started to go down to Ecuador a lot. I've been there, by the way, over 250 times, and I live in Manhattan. It was very clear that this trial that they agreed to do in Ecuador was just a little game for them, where they were trying to block progress of the trial every step of the way. Their main defense strategy, and we found this in some of their emails in later litigation, was to demonize Danziger. They literally put this in emails. Our strategy is to demonize Stephen Danziger, not to defend the claims of the indigenous groups on the merits. And we went another period of 8 years, okay, remember on top of the initial 10, another period of 8 years in Ecuador, putting in evidence. There were thousands of chemical sampling results, water samples, soil samples. Bottom line is, 2011, a trial court ruled in our favor despite incredible attempts by Texaco. It was actually then Chevron. Chevron bought Texaco in 2001 and took over this problem, despite a lot of attempts to try to block the case. And that came as a shock, I think, to Chevron. I think they kind of have a colonialist, I know they have a colonialist sort of racist view of indigenous people. I think they never thought the communities in Ecuador would have the wherewithal, the tenacity, the determination, the savvy to be able to figure out how to work with lawyers in the North and other countries to hold them accountable. So when it happened, they vowed never to pay the judgment that came out of the court where they wanted the trial to be held. And they then promptly sued me personally back in New York, Remember, New York's the venue where we wanted the trial held initially, and they wanted it in Ecuador. They came back to the very court that they didn't want the trial to be held to sue me personally for $60 billion. Okay, that is the most amount of money, billion by the way, not million, billion. That is the most amount of money that any individual in this country has ever been sued for. And just a little bit about myself, like I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Manhattan. I have a wife and a son. We live relatively modestly, and I don't have means. Like, I'm a human rights lawyer, and it's not like we were eating every day and we were okay, but I did not have the ability to defend a $60 billion lawsuit. I don't know, frankly, I don't know many people who would. So at that point, I began like an odyssey of dealing with this company's attacks on me that has lasted to this day, okay? The first thing they did is they sued me under civil RICO. A lot of you have probably heard of the racketeering statute. Donald Trump has been subjected to the Georgia state version of it. This is a new fossil fuel industry tactic, is they will sue activists and lawyers claiming the entire legal case, they did this in our case, was a conspiracy to extort money from them. That there really was no pollution down there that was harming anyone, and they called our entire case, this case by that point I worked for 18 years, they called it sham litigation. Ultimately, they dropped all the $60 billion on the eve of trial because under the 7th Amendment to the Constitution, if you're not sued for money, you don't get a jury. And at that point, I became the first defendant ever in a civil RICO. Remember, this is civil, it's for money, it's not criminal, okay? First defendant ever in a civil RICO case to be denied a jury. They took me into trial before a judge who was like a Federalist Society pro-corporate judge, and like in my opinion, the fix was in, I couldn't defend myself, and this judge convicted me on a civil standard, I did not have a jury, of all sorts of felony crimes, okay, based largely on the testimony of one witness paid $2 million from Chevron who claimed he was in a meeting where I approved the bribe of a trial judge in Ecuador. And I can assure you with every ounce of my body that did not happen. It's a big fat lie, but they were all kind of in on it, trying to find a way to taint me and taint the case. So when we took the Ecuador judgment into other countries to enforce it against their assets, they could hold up this court decision of the United States and say, you know, the Ecuador court ruled against us, but look what this US trial judge did, okay? He really is a better judge, and he determined that Steven Donziger is a criminal. Okay, so they criminalized me, or tried to. We kept fighting, and ultimately we won a unanimous Supreme Court decision in Canada allowing the communities in Ecuador to go forward to seizing Chevron's assets in Canada to enforce the judgment. Roughly around that time, Chevron came up with this crazy theory that I had violated the judgment that this judge had issued against me in the civil racketeering case simply by helping my clients in Ecuador raise funds to pay lawyers to enforce the judgment. That was their theory. And they also went after me for money. The judge issued millions of dollars of cost orders on me to basically squeeze me financially. He ordered me to pay their legal fees. There's still, by the way, a motion for me to pay them for $32 million. And when I couldn't pay that money, the judge ordered me to give them my computer on the theory that in my computer would be some evidence that I was hiding assets in other countries. It was all just made up crap, and I have no assets here or in other countries. And ultimately, I appealed that, and the judge charged me with criminal contempt of court for not obeying what clearly was a baseless order, but in any event, it was a court order, while I appealed the order. In other words, I appealed his order, and he charged me with a crime for not complying with an order while I was appealing it. I mean, I'd never heard of such a thing, nor has any other lawyer I've talked to. The crazy, crazy part is the regular federal prosecutor in New York, I don't know how many of you guys know the US justice system, but you know, every place in this country has a federal prosecutor appointed by the president. The one in New York at that time, Jeffrey Berman, who had been appointed by President Trump, refused to prosecute me based on these judges' charges. He said, I'm not doing this. It was so obvious that it was bogus. The judge then appointed a private corporate law firm with Chevron as a client, to prosecute me in the name of the US government. I'm pausing because when I've told this to people, or like people who, interns have told their parents, hey, I work for this guy who got prosecuted by Chevron and locked up, the parents usually say, no, that didn't happen, you're mistaken, or that can't happen in the United States of America. Okay. A Chevron lawyer became a prosecutor, and when I walked into court to deal with, by the way, this contempt was a misdemeanor. It's literally the lowest level federal offense. I believe I'm innocent of this. It's BS, but whatever. Let's assume I'm not innocent. No lawyer has ever been locked up on this offense level on a first-time charge in the history of our country. And I walked into court, and this judge, who is a Federalist member of the Federalist Society, slapped a GPS ankle bracelet on me. This was August 6, 2019. Sent me home, where I stayed literally for 2 years and 2 months. Could not leave. I mean, I could get out for like a lawyer meeting, a doctor meeting, or to walk my son to school. But I couldn't go out. I was living in our 2-bedroom apartment, and I couldn't even get a trial, partly because of COVID was delaying everything. The maximum sentence on a misdemeanor is 6 months in prison, and I had been in 2 years and 2 months prior to even getting a trial, much less being convicted. During this time, the United Nations has something called the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. They reviewed my case, determined my detention was illegal. They ordered me released, ordered the DOJ, the Department of Justice, to release me and pay me compensation for my detention. The DOJ just completely ignored this order. Eventually, I went to trial, again denied a jury. On top of the 2 years, by then 6 months of detention at home, the judge sentenced me to 6 months in prison on top of that. So a charge with the maximum sentence of 6 months, I ended up serving almost 4 times that amount. The longest sentence a lawyer had ever served for this charge was 90 days of home confinement. I served over 10 times that amount. It was all, in my opinion, retaliation. By the way, there is another view of this, and you can get it off of Chevron's website, and I want to put that out there because I would encourage people to go look at that. I can answer anything they have there, but they think I'm this big criminal. So in the end of the day, they basically took 3 years out of my life. During this time, I appealed to the US Supreme Court, this conviction. I had really good lawyers, including one right here from Austin, Texas, who teaches at UT Austin Law School named Stephen Vladeck. I was almost bombarded by lawyers trying to help me. People all across the political spectrum were completely offended by the idea of a private corporate prosecution. And I took it up to the Supreme Court, and the crazy part is the Supreme Court met 5 times, agonized, I believe, over whether to take this case or not. The US Supreme Court only takes 1 out of every 100 or so petitions where people ask for review. The Supreme Court in the United States reviews very, very few cases, maybe 50 a year. And they were debating, it's highly unusual, they usually meet once, they take it, or they usually reject the case. They met 5 times, couldn't decide what to do. Eventually they denied my review. But 2 justices, conservative justices appointed by Donald Trump, this is where it gets kind of really weird, Gorsuch and Kavanaugh issued a dissent in which they said my entire case was unconstitutional. Literally the quote they used was, "The Constitution does not allow what happened here." Well, I knew that. And in any event, once they decided not to take the case, I shifted gears, and I have decided, just so you know what I'm doing now, to launch a campaign to get President Biden to pardon me. Okay, it's the only recourse I have left in terms of the US legal system. As you probably know, presidents of the United States have unfettered power to issue pardons. I mean, Donald Trump pardoned dozens of people before the end of his last term with, mostly personal favors to various people. President Biden has been extremely I would say a little bit stingy in the number of pardons he issues, but this is an extraordinary case, in my opinion, given that it does involve the nation's first corporate prosecution. I am a human rights lawyer, and we are going out wide next week with a letter to Biden signed by several prominent US lawyers. It's a 12-page letter, and we have a petition, which I'm going to ask those of you who are here, if you're interested and want to help, to sign. I'll get to that in a second. But we continue to push. More importantly, in terms of the underlying case in Ecuador, there's no statute of limitations on enforcement of foreign judgments. I mean, the reason I think Chevron had me locked up is because we had organized very successful legal actions in Canada that posed enormous financial risk to billions of dollars of their assets. These types of enforcement cases in a commercial context are very normal. You know, in a human rights context, you usually don't see them because most of the communities that are marginalized and vulnerable do not have the resources to carry these types of cases forward. So I really believe that the thing that was really behind my detention was they didn't want me to travel to other countries to organize lawyers to do this. I've been to Canada 27 times, by the way, between the end of the Ecuador phase of the case and my detention, working with some really top lawyers up there. So my sincere hope is that this will be reactivated by other lawyers. I've been working on this over 30 years, and also I'm no longer a lawyer, by the way. I'm going to talk about that in a second. I got disbarred over all this. But it is still a very viable case, and my hope as, you know, a friend and a supporter of these communities in Ecuador, having worked there for so many years, is that this will finish. Now, you know, really, what's the big picture here, okay? What I really believe Chevron and the industry is trying to do through this case by blasting me, I got my law license taken away, by the way, without even a hearing. Only lawyer ever that I know of to have his law license taken away automatically without a hearing in a civil case. If you get convicted of a felony with a jury, it happens automatically, of a serious crime, but not in a civil case. They wouldn't allow me to challenge the findings of this judge based on that paid witness testimony. The fix was in, okay? I could not challenge my disbarment. On top of that, when the judge issued those cost orders for me to pay the millions of dollars, Chevron went into my bank accounts ex parte, that means I never got notified, and wiped them out, took all my money. Not that I had a lot of money, but our little family had saved money, and it just disappeared overnight without me knowing about it. To this day, I do not have a bank account. I can't have a bank account because I owe them so much money. I'm really worried that they would just come in and automatically take it. The way we live is my wife earns a modest salary as a PR director of a nonprofit arts institution, and I raise money through my defense fund website that goes to a law firm in Seattle that pays some of our household expenses and my rather considerable legal fees because I'm still dealing with all this stuff. Another fact is they won't let me travel internationally. I haven't left this country for 5 years. Remember, I went to Ecuador 250 times. I haven't left the country since I got detained. They took my passport, and even though my criminal sentence is over, they won't return my passport on the theory that unless I give them my computer, remember the computer issue? They will not give me my passport back and allow me to travel. And again, this goes, in my opinion, to the issue of them wanting me to not really talk and meet with lawyers in other countries where Chevron has assets who would potentially organize lawsuits to collect those assets to satisfy the judgment in Ecuador and save the lives of people in Ecuador. Big picture. This is a new corporate playbook. I'm just telling you, okay? It's actually not that new. It's been around a long time, but it's been like super turbo activated in recent years. The same law firm, Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, that Chevron hired to lock me up, prosecute me and lock me up, has sued Greenpeace, environmental group, in North Dakota on the same racketeering type of theory because of a campaign they did related to Standing Rock. Remember all the Standing Rock protests from a few years ago? Greenpeace has been in court and has spent, I can't even tell you how many millions of dollars of their precious resources that should be used to help people and help save the environment, and help save the planet, having to defend themselves against a pipeline company represented by Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher the same law firm that went after me. And getting back to my friend Chris Smalls, when Chris started organizing against Amazon, Jeff Bezos' company, that company hired Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher to do to Chris what they did to me, which is come up with a defamation campaign, where they started to act like Chris was some, I mean, Derek, you can tell more, but like he was some crazy man, basically. Just like they tried to make me into a criminal, they tried to make Chris into like a crazy man. And Chris is one of the savviest, smartest men of super high integrity. I mean, it's an honor to know him. By the way, he's like half my age. But what's so interesting is how there are law firms, and this is a leading law firm, that basically sell their services, okay, as lawyers to engage in defamatory attacks on people. On the theory, these companies have a theory that if you can knock out the leader of a lawsuit or of a labor organizing campaign, you can accomplish, through this kind of demonization campaign, what you could never really accomplish by working through the normal system, or in Chevron's case, actually defending the claims of the indigenous peoples on the merits of the claims. They want to do everything but actually deal with a lawsuit or deal with a labor organizing campaign. I would say the legal profession, my profession, is almost getting a free pass. If you think about the climate movement and how important it is to our lives, the lives of our kids, saving the planet. The fossil fuel industry, I can tell you, spends billions of dollars a year paying super skilled lawyers to keep us at bay. When you get too successful like me, they lock you up. But the run-of-the-mill cases that are filed by the state of California, the state of New Jersey, there's all this climate litigation happening now in the United States, and these law firms are enriching themselves by really engaging in super serious delay tactics to be sure that our courts don't deal with these very serious climate issues. And you could argue that what happened to me is, okay, there's this kind of one case and this one lawyer, it's never happened before, it might not happen again, okay? I mean, I don't know any other lawyer who's been locked up the way I have, okay? And you could say, well, that's kind of a one-off case. I actually think the Supreme Court, when they looked at my case, even though they wanted it because it was so crazy, they're like, that'll never happen again. Well, I don't believe that, actually. I believe when movements happen, and they get too powerful, and they challenge the entrenched interests to such a degree that these things can happen, and corrupt things can happen, and do happen in the American legal system. In the Amazon organizing case, just to mention one very obvious example, I mean, you can work at Amazon as a warehouse worker for years and years and years, and right now, you can never make more than about $21 an hour. Okay, it takes maybe 3-4 years to get to 21. You can work another 20, 30 years, you're never gonna get a wage increase. These guys in Staten Island finally organized a union, and they had a vote 2 years ago, and Amazon still refuses to sit down with them and negotiate a contract, taking advantage of the law, National Labor Relations Board processes, okay? And ultimately, if what happened in Staten Island with Chris Smalls and Derek Palmer were to be duplicated throughout the Amazon universe, it would cost that company literally billions of dollars in wealth. They'd have to take it out of the management and shareholders and give it to the workers. And when you have billions of dollars under attack, in our case by indigenous peoples who have no money, as we know money, in Amazon's case by warehouse workers who are smart and sophisticated, okay, they will spend untold sums of money, this is my experience, to prevent that from happening, up to and including really going after people in illegal and unethical ways with the help of judges at times. I'm not condemning the entire justice system of the United States of America, to be very clear. I actually believe in the rule of law. I went to law school because I actually love the law. But what I have learned over the course of my career, in the course of this case, is that there are pockets in this country where corruption happens, particularly when these powerful interests are sufficiently threatened. Happened to me, it's happening to some extent to Chris Smalls, and it's happening to Greenpeace, and and it's happening to a lot of other people in this country, and I promise you the media that most of us consume, including the cable networks, the mainstream news, really pay very, very little attention to this. I sat in my apartment for 2 years and 2 months, and I'm not nobody, okay? I came out of some privilege in my life. I went to Harvard Law School with the President of the United States, and I could not get the New York Times to come cover me, the story of an American lawyer locked up in the United States, even though their newsroom was about a 20-minute walk from my apartment. They wouldn't cover it. You know, but they covered lots of lawyers appropriately in Turkey and Myanmar and, you know, Syria and Russia who get locked up. Brazil under Bolsonaro, okay? All that, but in the United States, no, it was really hard to get a story about that. So I'm urging everyone to think deeply about these issues. I think they affect us all, I really do. I think they're intimately related to the survival of the planet. Like if we can't have the space to do this work, how the heck are we going to organize to change policy? So the fossil fuel industry, we can transition to clean energy and save our world. How the heck are we going to preserve our democracy, which is, I think, obviously very fragile right now? I mean, if an oil company can prosecute someone in the name of the US government and lock them up in an unprecedented way, that is a significant erosion of the rule of law in this country. But we see this all over the place now, especially with the composition of our Supreme Court. So all of these things are related. And by the way, I don't want to sit here and say like what happened to me is so much worse than shit that's happened to other people. I'm not going to say that, because there are people in this country who have suffered so much more than the pain that I have felt, especially in our criminal justice system. I mean, and by the way, I ended up 6 months in a federal prison in Danbury, locked in a cell for my misdemeanor. I walked into prison. The staff was like, what are you doing here? We have never seen anyone with this charge in this prison. We have never seen anyone. I went to Danbury, by the way, in Connecticut. We've never seen anyone in Danbury. There are 900 people there here on a misdemeanor. You're the only one. The only one. They were mystified how that could happen. But you hear stories all the time in prison. I can't even tell you the kind of stories I heard from the other people there that blew my mind about some of the things that are happening in our criminal justice system. So I just want to acknowledge that. Now, I want to open it up for questions, but I want to invite, I said we had a special guest. Let me tell you who that is. Do you guys know an actor named Lucy Lawless? She's from New Zealand. She's skipping back there. She's going to be out here in a second. In the 1990s, she played a very big role on a show. She was Xena, Warrior Princess. Those of us who are a little bit older remember her. When I was in detention at home with my ankle bracelet, I got a call from Lucy, cold call. And I'm not super culturally in tune. I've been so like in the silo of this case for so long. I didn't know who she was. She goes, hi, I'm here from New Zealand. I want to come see you. Bottom line is she came. We became fast friends. She actually went down to Ecuador to visit these communities while I was on detention. And she was extremely supportive to me and my family. And I want her out here to talk a little bit about what her experience was. Lucy, good to see you.
Hi. You usually stand up doing these things. It's so hard to.
Is it?
You know, I don't know.
Sometimes I stood up once in New York. I did one at the Society for Ethical Culture, and everyone's like, God, you just like were marauding around the stage. You were so crazy. Sit down and relax. So I'm trying to sit. Yeah. You're all for the marauders. I'm so honored. Yeah. By the way, the reason Lucy is here from New Zealand is she had a film shown yesterday here. Yeah. I haven't seen it, but I understand it's a fabulous film called Never Look Away.
Right, Never Look Away, about a crazy, sexy, just a bad girl who went off to war as a war camera person and worked for CNN and got her face blown off, and then powered through the rest of her life with a completely different mindset. Anyway, it's an awesome, rollicking ride through a highly unusual life. And like I say, she was she was a sexy, drug-taking bad girl. But
that's
it's
your directorial debut, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
It started me on a whole new career trajectory. But anyway, I've been an activist for a long time with Greenpeace and Greenpeace New Zealand, and trying to fight big oil's incursions into our waterways, and the fact that if there's a big oil spill, there's this pathetic cap, I can't remember what it is now, that barely covers like tissues for, drying your oil smothered birds. And then the rest of the cleanup is owned by the taxpayers. And all the oil gets shipped off elsewhere. So there's very poor returns. And when I met Stephen, he said, please go to Ecuador, I can't go. And I of course went, yeah, okay. So I went down to Lago Agrio, where the locals were like pissing and moaning about their skin lesions and their birth defects and their dead mothers and their loss of ancestral homes and waterways and crops, because the oil you dig down and a metre down, like 3 feet down, is just this water tail of oil. Anyway, what? Oh, my beads. Sorry, that's annoying, isn't it? Sorry, everybody. Thank you, ma'am.
Can you, I have some slides I'm going to show in a second that I think will give you a feel for this, but when you went to Ecuador, I mean, you've seen a lot, New Zealand and elsewhere over the course of your life. Like, describe what you saw in terms of the level of pollution and what the people were feeling.
There's this feeling of this very heavy sense of doom and tears, because for 50 years they've been saying our children are still being born with defects, and we've been told it's our fault because the doctors, they said, belonged to the oil company who gave them to understand that their dead babies were, God's will or their fault in some way. But the cancer rates are out of proportion with the rest of the country, way out of proportion, and way out of proportion to what they used to be. The jungle covers up the pollution. That's why you go, nothing to see here. But you dig down and it's all still there. It stinks. It's this pong, of diesel underground.
I don't know if the gentleman in the back can hear me, but can you just flip through some slides? I want you guys to see some of this stuff. Actually, this picture is on my first trip to Ecuador in April of 1993 on, completely naive lawyer. That's me on our left. I don't know what you guys are seeing, but this is our first trip. We were investigating what had happened. This is our little group of people, some of them that went down. Some of these are scientists. This is a pit. Chevron, by the way, left 1,000 of these waste pits in Ecuador, and they would light them on fire. This is me going into US court in the old days of the case with 2 indigenous leaders from Ecuador. And that's after I got out of my detention, speaking in DC at a rally. And this was a rally in front of the courthouse in the United States before my trial. I got a tremendous amount of support. That's actually the first day of the trial in Ecuador. On the street outside the courthouse, that's back in the US when they're trying to put me in jail. I was so lucky to get support, and this is just, see that ankle bracelet? I don't know if you guys can see that on my ankle, but that's a posed picture, by the way. And then we have this website, stevendonziger.us, that has a lot of information and ways to help. And then this picture was, again, the first day of the trial in Ecuador, at the lunch break, actually. It was so crazy. Lucy, I don't know if you noticed this when you were down there, but it's like, one of the things we tried to do with this case, I call it monetizing hope. If you have a legal claim, as these communities did, and you have no money to hire a lawyer, we designed an economic paradigm to raise money from donors and investors, okay? They would give it to the fund that we would then pay lawyers to do the case with. And the people who invested in the case would sign a contract with the clients to, in the event of a recovery, they would get their money back and a return on their investment. And let me just explain this. Now, a lot of people who do human rights are like, what the fuck? It's like, that's crazy. But what we tried to do was turn the idea of doing good into a self-sustaining economic model, knowing, by the way, that Chevron was spending millions, ultimately hundreds of millions, and up to $3 billion on this case, and we had no money. I mean, our clients had no money. And like a lot of lawyers like me have worked on this case either for free or extremely low cost. Like people don't charge their fees. The way lawyers would get paid is out of a piece of a recovery, should there ever be a recovery. There hasn't been yet. But the interesting thing about me, even though I've spent 30 years of my life on this and I have no bank account, is Judge Kaplan, who's the judge who convicted me in this non-jury civil case based on false evidence, barred me from ever collecting my fee on this case. You know, so
what did they spend? What did they spend pursuing you, do you reckon?
It's crazy. I mean, I was going up against 60 law firms and 2,000 lawyers at the height.
60?
Literally. Yeah, 60 law firms. I mean, think about these companies, you know, it's all just economics, right? Like you have a $10 billion judgment, like, well, and you are getting close to their money. They're like, well, we'll spend 50 million, 100 million, 200 million, $1 billion even.
Totally worth it.
To prevent it from happening, to prevent the transfer from happening back down to the people they poisoned, okay? And the reason, by the way, that they spend so much money on this particular case is because it's innovative. I mean, I actually believe that, you know. This model of like what I just described, like how we financed it, how we used lawyers from Ecuador, the United States, the UK, Canada, Argentina. We had lawyers from all over the world working on this. This scared the F out of them, okay? It's not something they ever thought they would have to deal with in the course of their history. I mean, meaning big oil's history. Because like when you go to a relatively impoverished place like Ecuador and you just start dumping for no reason other than to try to make more money, knowing it's gonna harm people and ultimately kill people, and like you get sued by the people, I swear to God, Chevron actually experienced our lawsuit as some sort of victimization of them by the people they poisoned. Like they're like, wait, you can't do this. We didn't negotiate this. How can you sue us? You know? And they treated it like they were the victims of the people of Ecuador. I mean, it's just the psychology involved.
You know what is interesting about the psychology, though? They are prone or sensitive to the opinions of their shareholders. Mm-hmm. So when you show to the shareholders that what they're doing is tawdry, shameful, distasteful, whatever, ridiculous, the shareholders' feedback, that's who they care about.
Yeah, it's true. But the thing is about shareholders, this is crazy. For years, and we still do this, we've had people come up from Ecuador, some of the people affected, because you know, at a shareholder meeting, there's an open Q&A session at the end, and you got the CEO of a company sitting there, and for year after year, we would have these indigenous leaders directly confront the CEO of Chevron. Like, what are you doing? And they were so whack about it that they actually made videos for years about me. They say, well, no, actually, you should, you know, you're worried about like what happened to you, you should talk to your lawyer. And they pop in a video, it's like 2 minutes, basically, you know, depicting me in the worst possible way.
Yeah, they'll do a cut and paste.
You know what I mean? And you know, they were just so rude, you know, to people who traveled far to sort of try to find a solution. And by the way, one thing I've learned, I mean, you don't have to be, I mean, I'm sorry, I might be a little naive. You can't convince Chevron or any oil company to do the right thing on the basis of the fact that it's right. I mean, there's no like arguments of morality that they will ever listen to. And you know, we have always tried to hit them in the language that they speak, which is money. Like we got the judgment, and it's substantial. It's actually not that substantial. Just by comparison, BP has paid about $75 billion for the Deepwater Horizon accident, that awful accident in the Gulf of Mexico, in 2010, over time, between lawsuits, fines, and various other liabilities. So to have a $10 billion liability over something that I think is far worse in a much more pristine ecosystem, not to compare, I don't like to do that, but like many people have died. You know, I would say thousands have died, but we can't prove it because there's never been a study, and it costs millions of dollars to sort of do these types of epidemiological studies to, you know, definitively prove it. But, you know, they you know, it's just extraordinary to really think about that.
What have you learned about power?
Power?
For this?
We don't have that much of it. Sorry. No, that's a great question. I've learned a lot about power. First of all, I've grown a lot, obviously, since this started, working on it over 30 years, and I've been, there was a time when they really started going after me and I was very terrified. I just thought, God, how am I going to get out of this? I can't even get money to hire a lawyer to deal with this, much less pay what ultimately they're trying to get from me. And I realized the power I needed to generate was the solidarity of people in the world. I mean, I don't know how many of y'all here had heard about this story or follow me or have been on our website. Chris Small's the same thing. When I got locked up, someone came to my house, a woman I have deep respect for, and she said, whatever you do, it was like a month. I actually thought for the first year it would be another week and I'd be free. I kept thinking it'd be next week. So I never was able to accept what was actually happening to me. I think I was in denial. And ultimately I'm like, oh my God, I'm never gonna get off house arrest until I go to prison. That kind of dawned on me, but if I go to prison, I actually thought they could kill me. I'm not gonna lie. I was desperate to stay out of prison. I'm not saying I was certain they were gonna kill me or there was some conspiracy, but shit happens in prison all the time, as you know, and I was just worried I wouldn't get out if I went. So the solidarity, generating your own power became very important. And I will say that, and I was talking to Derek about this earlier today, I think they always try to convince us, they being the corporate sector that doesn't want us holding them accountable, that we have less power than we do. When I got out of law school, I had an interview with Ralph Nader, great consumer advocate, lawyer, for a job. And he said, I didn't take the job. Well, I don't even know if he offered it. I did not work for him. But he said to me something I've never forgotten. He said, Steve, he said, the worst sin in life is not to use the power that you have. We have power, collectively. Okay, individually, maybe not so much. Collectively, we have massive power. And I would argue that they try to convince us we don't have this power. I would argue that what they did to me in a very visible way, they weren't embarrassed, by the way, to prosecute me privately and lock me up. They wanted people to know this was happening.
To chill the action.
They wanted people to know they had that power.
Yeah.
They wanted people to know they could control the judiciary of our country as a corporation. They wanted to brag about it. They want everyone to know that because they want people to become intimidated. And I cannot calculate. I mean, look, there's a certain quantum of lawyers and advocates who probably look at my story and have become inspired, I hope, who's I want to do that work. But I guarantee you there's another quantum that I had never met who just say, I can never do that work. Look what happened to that guy. And they're very clever and they know that. But I would say it's up to us, the people or the people who want to really do this work. I mean, by the way, whatever you do, if it's not this work, I respect you, all the power to you. But if you want to get into this field of climate justice or corporate accountability or human rights, and you rise it to a high enough level, you're going to hit resistance. And if you're not prepared to deal with it both financially and psychologically, you could really get hurt. I speak a lot, by the way, to law schools, law students who ask me these questions all the time. And I spoke at Columbia Law School recently, and I said, here are my 5, pieces of advice on how to take on corporate power. I can't actually remember them as I sit here, but one of them is you need to build teams and solidarity so you're not sitting out there alone. I think one of my mistakes was I was very alone. I was working out of my apartment, and the case got so big so fast, and it got so much attention, and they were under so much threat. They're oh, that guy's working out of his apartment. Let's just go after him. We could probably knock out the whole case. And they didn't, by the way, because we're still going. But how to sort of do an assessment of the power landscape when you enter this kind of work is really important. I'm sure you do that when you do your activism in New Zealand. What do we have? And how do we generate power? I mean, my pardon campaign to Biden is a way I can generate power and leverage, And I actually think we can get thousands of people in this country and around the world to join in and sort of learn about this and understand the dangers that I'm talking about in some detail to you folks today. You know what I mean? It's really important we keep organizing and talking about this and talking about these threats to our freedom and our democracy and our way of life. Because by the way, even we might be progressive activists, we might be climate activists, but I'm sorry, we are also patriotic people who care about our country, okay? And you cannot tell me that what Chevron did is consistent with the values of what, at least the aspirational values of the United States of America. It's crazy. Like, we don't live in a corporate-controlled society. We live in a democracy that is under threat right now. What happened to me is an example of that. By the way, I forgot, I think people have questions. Are there questions that we have through the app? Oh, there are questions. This is crazy. I've never used this system. I usually love when people...
Shall I read it and you give the answer?
Well, I don't know if we have to answer. Yeah, go ahead. What the...
The justice system is so difficult to navigate and drive change. How did or do you find the will to fight on with major injustices brought upon you?
I would just say, like I said, with lots of love and support and organizing, like grassroots organizing. And by the way, my website is, I just started a new one, stephendonziger.us. I used to have a website, stephendonziger.com, and in all of my stress, I let the payment lapse, and someone bought it and wanted to charge me a bunch of money to get it back. I'm not doing it. So it's stephendonziger.us. Check it out. You can also sign our petition and help in any way you can. Join the campaign. Give us your email. We send out a regular newsletter. Let's go to the next one.
I wish Chris Smalls was here to answer that question, because that would have been really interesting from his perspective, huh? How can we as individuals, or maybe as collectives, use our power and reasonably expose and fight against irresponsible capitalism?
There's so many ways. I would say that wherever you work, whatever sector you're in, whatever community you're in, we all need to engage at some level in the battle to make our world better, to make our society better and more fair. And you can't answer the specifics except to say, do it, like figure it out, find people who are doing it. A lot of it is the upfront assessment of the dynamic, like what's our goal, what's our strategy, how many resources do we need? By the way, this big case that landed me in prison is just, it's kind of a outlier case. I mean, like, most battles for social justice that take place at the community level are eminently achievable, And I believe this case is still completely winnable, and we will win. We have won. We will collect the judgment. So people just need to figure out what they want to do. I would say start in your neighborhood, your community, and just get engaged and do something.
Maybe vote with your dollar. Be careful about where you spend it. You worked hard for that. Place it in a way that makes it known. You can get online and tell people how you feel about their product.
This is a good question. If we do, you want to read it?
If we do not work in the climate justice field, how can we still contribute positively to ensure just outcomes in the field?
I would say, this might sound crass, but I would say look for organizations that do the really good frontline work and support them financially. If you're not doing the work yourself, but if you have resources, consider that. And by the way, you probably say, well, how do I decide what groups I should support? I would say this is, to me, is the key criterion. The fault line in the environmental movement is between groups that really take on corporate power, the corporations, the fossil fuel industry that really are destroying the planet, and those who sort of work more in conservation. I'm not saying don't support conservation, that's good. But like the groups who really confront the corporations and sort of pay the biggest price for that work are usually the most under-resourced groups in the environmental field. Groups like Amazon Watch, Rainforest Action Network are examples of two, Greenpeace. These are groups that really do the frontline work. The other thing I'd say is look for indigenous organizations, because the indigenous, people don't really understand this, I think, fully enough. There's 400 million indigenous peoples in the world, okay? These people are the frontline defenders of the planet. And countries like the United States and your country and Australia, are countries that are really owned by indigenous peoples, and land has been taken, okay? So we right now are on original indigenous land. I should have researched this. I don't know what the indigenous groups that lived in this part of Texas were. Maybe somebody knows and can help me. But bottom line is, indigenous groups themselves need to be strengthened, and there's several organizations and ways to do that. These people are on the front lines of the battle to save the planet. What is the, oh, go ahead.
What does the timeline for the rest of the case look like for collecting judgment, et cetera?
That totally depends on level of resources and willingness of lawyers to do it. You know, as I said, I was disbarred, I can't leave the country. And I'm not gonna lie, it's challenging to get other lawyers to like do the due diligence. This case is so long, so complex. People look at me like, I don't wanna be like that guy. It's a heavy lift as Chevron designed it to get other lawyers to wanna jump in and actually represent the people of Ecuador, even though almost all are completely sympathetic with the cause, like to think, oh God, am I gonna risk my law firm, my livelihood, you know? So it depends very much on, I think, putting together a syndicate of lawyers so we don't just rely on like one or a small number of people, and getting the level of resources needed. There are efforts being made in that regard. If that can be put together in the right way, I think this whole thing can, once it relaunches, hopefully be over in about 3 years.
Do you have any favorite books or podcasts or films on climate justice that you'd recommend?
I'd recommend two. I have a bunch, but I'll recommend two. There's a woman named Amy Westervelt. I don't know if you know her. She runs a podcast called Drilled. She's probably one of the 2 best climate journalists in the country, in my opinion. Another woman named Emily Atkin, A-T-K-I-N, who runs a great newsletter called Heated. It's amazing because a lot of the mainstream journalists get their story ideas from Amy and Emily, okay? But if you go directly to, for example, Emily's Substack, which I would recommend. By the way, I have a Substack too. If you can, please subscribe. I only have 4,000 followers, I'm trying to build it. And I write about lots of topics, not just Chevron, not just climate. I write about what's going on in the Middle East and all sorts of stuff, but from the perspective of a human rights attorney. But in any event, Emily Atkin and Amy Westervelt are 2 people I deeply admire. They're great climate journalists. Oh, books. I got a great book recommendation, okay, I read recently. Well, I'm gonna give you 2. Does anyone know Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island? He's a former Attorney General of Rhode Island, a lawyer. He wrote a book called The Scheme about a year ago. I read it cover to cover, and it meticulously documents how our federal judiciary has been taken over by the fossil fuel industry and corporate elements to the point where it's not fair anymore, including the US Supreme Court, which now has 6 out of 9 justices who are really ultra conservative. It's called The Scheme. It's shocking. It really is a telltale analysis and summary of like a lot of things that are happening in our country that have a lot to do with the rise of Donald Trump, have a lot to do with my private corporate prosecution. Sheldon Whitehouse, The Scheme is one of my favorite recent books. I also want to recommend a book, sorry to talk about this, I wanted to avoid this, on Gaza, on Palestine. I'm a Jew, an American Jew who has been deeply troubled, to be frank, by what I'm witnessing in terms of post-October 7th events, but troubled by a lot of things. But I never felt like I really understood the history of what was going on. And there's a book by a Columbia University history professor named Rashidi Khalidi. It's called The 100 Years' War on Palestine, that literally opened me to a whole different perspective on what I had been taught growing up as a young Jewish man in the United States of America. It's called 100 Years' War on Palestine. It's a book of the utmost high scholarship, and it gives a much broader perspective than we usually get in the US media. By the way, I consume news information largely based on trying to get real good stuff that you're not gonna see in the networks or the New York Times. Although I do read the New York Times because I wanna know what's going on in terms of how they see stuff. But like, it's very important to go beyond those sources and really try to liberate ourselves in such a way as we can make informed decisions as informed citizens. I think we're out of time.
Can I ask one question?
Sure.
Where is Chris Smalls?
So Chris should be here hopefully within the hour. You know, he tried to get on a plane this morning in New York and was hit with some weird hostility. You know, this is the crazy thing about corporate power is like, you could say, well, there's something happened behind the scenes that maybe Amazon orchestrated, because this was a pretty heavily advertised event on Instagram, and like they blocked him from getting on a plane to get here, you know, or maybe it was just something else, I don't know. But like what happened to Chris at the airport was unusual, you know, where he was given the runaround, wasn't let on the plane, they claimed they didn't have his ticket, blah, blah, blah. And it's unfortunate he's not here, because I can tell you his perspective, about Amazon is similar to mine about Chevron, and it's really powerful to hear it from two people and two different experiences. I mean, you know, I'm kind of an outlier experience, but I also think it's illustrative of something deep happening in our country. And I think Chris's experience is very typical for successful union organizers where corporations just try to pound them. So in any event, I'll just end by saying Chris will be here with me at this club called the Far Out Lounge on Wednesday night. There's a show, it has a bunch of music. It's gonna be a lot of fun. So not just us talking for an hour, it's gonna be a party, dancing, music. It's from 8 to 11 p.m. At 5 p.m. though, if you really want to commit to the evening, there's going to be a showing of, and this is a new documentary film about Chris and his union organizing campaign.
Called?
It's called, Derek, what's it called? Union?
American.
Americana?
American.
American,
like,
okay. Oh, that's good. American,
Yeah.
C-O-N-N-E-D. Gotcha. A little slow. Anyway, that's showing at 5 o'clock at the Far Out Lounge. And then the director of the film is going to come and do a Q&A. So that'll go from like 5 to 7:30, and then at 8, we're gonna start our session, which we had intended to do here today, and have a party and probably go pretty late. It's $10. It's not an official South by Southwest event. It's gonna be a lot of fun, and we encourage everyone to come and tell people about it.
Say again, what day?
Wednesday, the 13th of March.
Wednesday,
At the
13th.
Far Out Lounge in
Far Out Lounge.
South Austin. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Okay, I really appreciate it.